Move aside, old black man. Rear Admiral Vance Harlan sneered, snatching the elderly visitor's invitation and holding it high for everyone to see before letting it flutter onto the concrete. This ceremony is for real Navy legends, not some retired nobody hoping to fool people with gray hair and a sad story. A few officers chuckled. Vance looked the 74-year-old black man up and down with open contempt before brushing imaginary dust from the front of his own immaculate dress uniform. So tell me, old man, what's your rank? He mocked loudly. Or is professional impostor the highest title you ever earned? Without waiting for an answer, he smirked and pointed toward the rows of decorated SEAL veterans. Look around. Every medal here was earned. Every scar has a story. The only thing you brought is an old coat and the nerve to stand where real heroes belong. The laughter grew louder. Vance took one slow step closer until they were nearly face to face. I have commanded warriors who bled for this country, he said coldly. You expect me to believe an old black man dressed like that belongs in their company. Don't insult every SEAL standing here. Well, the crowd shifted uncomfortably as two security officers stepped forward. The old man never argued. He simply bent down, picked up his invitation, brushed the dust from its edge, and quietly slipped it back into his pocket. Vance laughed even harder. Go home before you embarrass yourself any further, he sneered. History doesn't remember men like you. It remembers the officers who actually earned their place. As the old man calmly reached to straighten the sleeve of his worn jacket, a faded tattoo briefly appeared on the inside of his forearm. Vance's smile vanished. For the first time that morning, the Admiral looked afraid. Before we reveal why one forgotten tattoo silenced an entire Navy ceremony, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. If stories of honor, courage, and justice inspire you, subscribe and stay with us until the very end, because the truth behind this quiet old man will leave everyone speechless. Before anyone questioned his honor, before an admiral mocked him in front of an entire Navy ceremony, 74-year-old Silas Reed woke before sunrise in the small coastal town of Oceanside, California. His modest house overlooked neither the ocean nor expensive neighborhoods. It sat quietly at the end of an aging street where American flags hung from front porches and neighbors still greeted one another by name. Every morning followed the same routine. Silas folded his blanket with military precision, brewed a pot of black coffee, and stood silently before a wooden shelf filled with photographs. Some showed smiling young sailors. Others showed folded American flags resting inside glass cases. Each picture represented someone who had never come home. He gently wiped a thin layer of dust from one frame. I promised I'd keep visiting them, he whispered. No one heard him. No one ever did. Twice every week, Silas volunteered at the Harbor Gold Star Family Center, helping widows, parents, and children of fallen service members complete paperwork, repair broken fences, carry groceries, or simply sit beside them when anniversaries became too painful to face alone. Most families knew him only as Mr. Reed. Few asked about his own military service. Whenever someone thanked him, he answered with the same quiet smile. I've simply been blessed to have more tomorrows than many good men. That morning, however, something unusual waited inside his mailbox, a cream-colored envelope bearing the official seal of the United States Navy. Inside rested an invitation. You are cordially invited to attend the Coronado Naval Memorial Ceremony honoring extraordinary service and sacrifice. No explanation, no personal note, only a guest pass bearing his full name. Silas stared at the invitation for nearly a minute. Then he carefully placed it back inside the envelope as though it were something fragile. I suppose someone finally remembered, he murmured. But remembered what? He never answered the question, even to himself. Instead, he slipped the invitation into an old leather folder that looked almost as worn as the denim jacket he had owned for over 20 years. On the morning of the ceremony, the drive from Oceanside to Coronado felt strangely familiar. The ocean breeze carried memories he had spent decades refusing to revisit. Every bridge, every harbor, every glimpse of gray naval ships anchored offshore reminded him of faces that existed now only in memory. When he finally arrived, Coronado Naval Base was already alive with activity. Rows of spotless white uniforms reflected the morning sunlight. Military bands rehearsed nearby. Families gathered around memorial walls engraved with the thousands of names. News crews adjusted cameras while volunteers handed out commemorative programs. It was a day meant to honor sacrifice, or so Silas believed. He parked his aging pickup truck at the far end of the visitor lot. Several expensive black SUVs rolled into reserved parking spaces nearby. No one noticed the old truck. Silas preferred it that way. He stepped out wearing neatly pressed khaki pants, polished brown shoes, a clean blue shirt, and the faded navy jacket that had accompanied him through countless quiet years. There were no medals on his chest, no ribbons, nothing that demanded attention. As he approached the registration tent, a young volunteer smiled politely. "Good morning, sir. Invitation, please." Silas handed over the envelope. The young woman scanned the barcode. Her smile faded. She scanned it again, then once more. "I'm sorry, sir." She frowned at the screen. "It says your invitation is valid." Relieved, Silas nodded, but she hesitated. "Your guest category has been classified." Before Silas could respond, another volunteer leaned over. "Classified?" The young man laughed quietly. "What does that even mean?" He pressed several keys before shaking his head. "I've never seen this code before." A nearby lieutenant overheard the conversation and walked over. The volunteer pointed towards Silas. "His invitation works, Lieutenant, but we can't access any background information." The officer accepted the card and scanned it himself. Again, the same result. Valid entry, record restricted. The lieutenant frowned. "Restricted?" He looked up at Silas. "Sir, were you informed someone would be meeting you?" Silas simply shook his head. "No." "Do you know why your records are sealed?" "I've never asked." The lieutenant studied the elderly black man's calm expression, uncertain what to make of that answer. Most people would have become defensive. Others would have demanded explanations. Silas merely waited patiently, quietly, as if delays no longer had the power to bother him. The lieutenant finally handed back the invitation. "Everything appears legitimate, sir. Please proceed to the Memorial Plaza." "Thank you." Silas offered a grateful nod before continuing toward the ceremony. Several officers watched him walk away. One whispered, "Strange." Another replied, "Probably some administrative error." No one imagined they had just spoken about a man whose name had been intentionally buried for decades. As Silas crossed the plaza, he paused beside the black granite memorial wall. His fingers rested gently on a single engraved name. His lips moved silently. No tears came. Those had long since been exhausted. Only respect remained. Behind him, engines rumbled as another convoy of official vehicles entered the base. Doors opened. Senior officers stepped onto the pavement. Among them walked Rear Admiral Vance Harlan, surrounded by aides, photographers, and junior commanders eager to impress him. Vance adjusted the gold stars on his shoulders before scanning the crowd with practiced confidence. His eyes drifted across decorated veterans, government officials, gold star families. Then they stopped. Far across the plaza stood an elderly black man in a faded jacket, quietly touching the memorial wall. Vance narrowed his eyes. "Who's that?" he asked. No one around him had an answer. Vance frowned. "Find out." Within minutes, he began walking directly toward Silas Reed. Neither man realized that their first conversation was about to ignite the most unforgettable scandal in the history of the Coronado Naval Memorial Ceremony. Rear Admiral Vance Harlan walked across the Memorial Plaza with the confidence of a man who had spent his entire career being saluted before he ever spoke. Conversations faded as officers noticed him approaching. Junior commanders straightened their uniforms. Photographers lifted their cameras. Vance acknowledged no one. His attention remained fixed on the elderly black man standing quietly before the memorial wall. Silas still hadn't moved. His fingers rested lightly on the engraved name before him. Only after several silent seconds did he remove his hand and place his weathered cap beneath his arm. Vance stopped a few feet away. "Excuse me." Silas turned with a polite smile. "Good morning." Vance didn't return it. "I'm Rear Admiral Vance Harlan." "I know who you are, Admiral." "Then you also know this section is reserved for invited military personnel and honored guests." Silas calmly reached into his jacket and handed over the cream-colored invitation. Vance barely glanced at it before passing it to Commander Avery Lang. "Verify it." Avery scanned the card with her handheld device. A moment later, she frowned. "It's valid, Admiral." Vance crossed his arms. "Then display his service record." Avery pressed several buttons. The screen flashed once. "Access restricted." She tried again. The same message appeared. Vance's expression hardened. "What do you mean restricted?" I can't open anything." Vance took the scanner himself. He entered a command override. Again, record restricted. Nothing else. No branch history. No deployments. No medals. No retirement record. Nothing. A few nearby officers exchanged puzzled looks. Vance let out a dry laugh. "Interesting." He slowly looked Silas up and down. No service history, no visible decorations, no identification beyond an invitation no one can explain. He handed the scanner back. "So tell me, Mr. Reed," his voice grew louder, "what exactly qualifies you to stand among America's heroes?" Several people nearby turned toward them. Silas answered quietly, "I came because I was invited." Vance smiled sarcastically. "That wasn't my question." Silas remained silent. The Admiral stepped closer. "I've spent 30 years protecting the reputation of this uniform." He tapped the gold stars on his shoulder. "I don't tolerate imposters." Whispers spread through the growing crowd. "What's happening? Who is that man? Did someone sneak in?" Sierra Blake, a national news reporter covering the ceremony, noticed the commotion immediately. She signaled her cameraman, "Keep rolling." Within seconds, the confrontation was being recorded from multiple angles. Vance seemed almost pleased by the attention. "If you're truly military," he continued, "answer one simple question." He folded his hands behind his back. "What was your rank?" Silence. Silas simply looked at him. Vance chuckled. "You forgot?" Still no answer. One of the younger officers laughed under his breath. Vance heard it and smiled. "I've never met a real serviceman who couldn't answer that question." The laughter grew slightly louder. Vance turned toward the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he gestured toward Silas, "this is exactly why we verify every guest." Then he faced Silas again. "Well, what's your rank, old man?" Silas took a slow breath. "I don't discuss my service." Vance laughed openly. "You don't discuss it." He shook his head. "Or you can't invent it fast enough." Several uncomfortable chuckles echoed around the plaza. Even some civilians began whispering. I knew something looked odd. He doesn't even have medals. Maybe he's pretending. Eh. Sierra Blake lowered her microphone for a moment. Something about the old man's expression bothered her. He wasn't frightened, he wasn't angry. He almost looked saddened, not because of the insults, because of where they were happening. Vance noticed Silas looking toward the memorial wall again. "Don't." His voice sharpened. "Don't hide behind those names." He pointed toward the black granite monument. "Every person on that wall earned the right to be remembered." Then he looked Silas directly in the eyes. "You haven't convinced me you've earned the right to stand beside them." The words landed like a punch. Several Gold Star families exchanged uneasy glances. An elderly widow quietly whispered to her daughter, "He reminds me of my husband." "What do you mean?" "The way he stands, so still, so respectful. Soldiers don't lose that." Nearby, Master Chief Roland Voss had been listening without speaking. The retired SEAL was 76 years old. His shoulders slightly bent with age, but his eyes remained remarkably sharp. He studied Silas carefully. The posture, the calm breathing, the complete refusal to react under pressure. Something felt familiar. Very familiar. Roland frowned. "I've seen that before. But where?" His memories stretched back decades. Training compounds, hidden facilities, faces that no longer appeared in official records. Before he could think further, Vance spoke again. "Security." Two military police officers approached. Petty Officer Caleb Thorne stopped beside the Admiral. "Yes, sir." "If this gentleman can't identify his military rank," Vance paused deliberately, "escort him outside the secured ceremony area." The crowd fell silent. Caleb looked uncertain. "Sir, the invitation scanned as valid." Vance answered without looking at him. "And I said, remove him." Caleb hesitated. His eyes met Silas. "I'm sorry, sir." Silas offered him a gentle smile. "It's all right." He reached into his pocket and carefully folded the invitation. "I don't want to cause trouble." For the first time, several spectators looked uncomfortable. A little girl standing beside her Navy veteran grandfather tugged gently on his sleeve. "Grandpa, is that man bad?" The old veteran watched Silas quietly. "No, I don't think he is." Vance heard none of it. He believed he had complete control of the situation. Sierra Blake quietly stepped toward Commander Avery Lang. "Has anyone actually confirmed this man's identity?" Avery lowered her voice. "No, but something doesn't add up." "What do you mean?" Avery glanced around before answering. "I've never seen a classified guest code like his." Sierra looked toward Silas again. "So why hasn't anyone said that?" Avery answered, "Because the Admiral already decided who he thinks this man is." Just then, a black government SUV rolled through the security gate without stopping. Unlike the ceremonial vehicles parked outside, this one carried no flag, no public markings, only discreet federal plates. It rolled silently toward the administrative building before coming to a stop. Three men in dark suits stepped out carrying a long, locked military transport case stamped with a bright red warning, "Authorized personnel only." Master Chief Roland Voss stared at the case. His face slowly lost all color. "No," he whispered. "It can't be." Master Chief Roland Voss could not take his eyes off the long military transport case. His breathing became shallow. There were only a handful of reasons the Navy Archive Division would send a sealed container under armed escort. None of them were ordinary. "What is it, Roland?" asked another retired SEAL standing beside him. Roland didn't answer immediately. Instead, he kept staring at the red security marking. "I haven't seen one of those in over 40 years. Before his friend could ask another question, Rear Admiral Vance Harlan's sharp voice echoed across the plaza once again. "Well," he looked directly at Silas Reed, "are you leaving voluntarily, or do I need my officers to escort you out?" The entire memorial ceremony had nearly come to a standstill. The Navy band had stopped playing. Families whispered among themselves. Journalists edged closer. Sensing the story unfolding before them was becoming much bigger than a routine veterans memorial ceremony. Petty Officer Caleb Thorne shifted uneasily. He lowered his voice. Sir, Silas looked at him with kind eyes. I know you're only doing your job. Caleb nodded awkwardly. I'm sorry. Without another word, Silas turned toward the memorial wall one last time. His eyes settled on the engraved names. For several quiet seconds, he simply stood there. Then he slowly raised his right hand and delivered a crisp military salute. Not rushed, not theatrical, perfect. Every movement was deliberate, every angle exact, the kind of salute built from decades of discipline. Several older veterans noticed immediately. One Marine colonel quietly frowned. Did you see that? His wife nodded. That wasn't learned at a parade. Another retired Navy captain whispered, Whoever trained that man trained him the old way. Vance rolled his eyes. A salute proves nothing. He waved dismissively. Anyone can imitate discipline. Silas lowered his hand without responding. He turned and began walking toward the exit exactly as instructed. No complaints, no arguments, no attempt to defend himself. The silence surrounding him somehow felt louder than shouting. Sierra Blake continued filming. She quietly spoke into her microphone. Viewers, we're witnessing an extraordinary scene. An elderly guest with a valid Navy invitation is being removed despite officials acknowledging his credentials cannot be accessed. Questions are beginning to spread throughout the crowd. Nearby, Commander Avery Lang walked quickly toward Vance. Admiral. Vance didn't look at her. What? I've contacted Naval Personnel Command and they can't access his file either. Vance smirked. Convenient. They said the restriction originates above their clearance. Vance finally turned. Above? Yes, sir. Vance laughed. So now we're pretending this mysterious old man has files even admirals can't read. Avery hesitated. I'm only telling you what they said. Vance folded his arms. They're mistaken. Avery wanted to argue. Instead, she remained silent. Years of service had taught her when a superior officer had stopped listening. Meanwhile, Silas continued walking across the plaza. People instinctively stepped aside to let him pass. Some looked embarrassed, others looked suspicious. A young sailor muttered to his friend, If he were really somebody important, wouldn't everyone know his name? His friend shrugged. I guess. An elderly woman standing nearby overheard them. No. Both sailors turned toward her. My husband served in Vietnam. She clutched the folded American flag resting against her chest. He told me the greatest heroes were usually the ones nobody was allowed to talk about. The two sailors exchanged uncertain glances. Neither replied. Back near the stage, the black government SUV had drawn increasing attention. 3 officials in dark suits walked toward Captain Grant Hollis. One quietly presented identification. Hollis read it. His posture immediately stiffened. Welcome, sir. One of the officials asked calmly. Has Mr. Silas Reed arrived? Hollis blinked. Yes. Where is he now? Hollis hesitated before looking toward the edge of the plaza. He is being escorted out. For the first time, the official's expression changed. What? Hollis swallowed. There seems to be some confusion regarding his records. The official's voice became noticeably firmer. There should be no confusion. He turned toward the 2 armed sailors guarding the transport case. Bring it. Without another word, the guards lifted the heavy case and followed him toward the ceremony. Across the plaza, Vance was still addressing members of the press. The Navy has a responsibility to protect the integrity of its traditions. Sierra Blake asked, Admiral Harlan, are you saying this gentleman is impersonating military service? Vance answered confidently, I'm saying no one receives special recognition without verifiable records. Sierra pressed again, but his invitation is authentic. Administrative mistakes happen. And the classified guest designation? Vance smiled. I've spent 30 years handling classified operations. He shrugged dismissively. I've never heard of Silas Reed. Several reporters wrote down the statement immediately. Only a few yards away, Roland Voss closed his eyes. He whispered almost to himself. That's exactly the problem. What do you mean? Another veteran asked. Roland slowly opened his eyes. There were men whose names weren't supposed to exist. Before anyone could question him further, movement near the entrance drew every eye. The 3 government officials walked directly through the center of the crowd. The heavy transport case rolled behind them. 2 armed sailors accompanied every step. People instinctively moved aside. No one spoke. The official leading the group stopped directly before Rear Admiral Vance Harlan. He calmly produced a sealed authorization folder. I'm Dr. Julian Crow, Director of the Naval Historical Archives. Vance offered a polite nod. I wasn't informed anyone from Archives would be attending. You weren't. Crow's expression remained unreadable. We're here under direct authorization from the Office of the Secretary of the Navy. Vance's confidence faltered for the first time. I see. Crow looked around. Where is Mr. Silas Reed? Vance casually gestured toward the exit. He was being removed. Crow stared at him for several long seconds. He said absolutely nothing. Then he quietly asked, "You ordered Silas Reed removed before speaking to us?" Vance suddenly felt dozens of eyes turning toward him. He forced a smile. "I acted according to protocol." Crow slowly closed the authorization folder. "No, Admiral." His voice was calm. "You acted before understanding who was standing in front of you." The entire plaza fell silent. Even Vance had no immediate reply. At that exact moment, Silas Reed reached the main gate. He paused only because someone behind him called his name. "Mr. Reed." It wasn't Vance. It wasn't security. It was Dr. Julian Crow. And for the first time that morning, every senior officer on the parade ground watched as the director of the Naval Historical Archives removed his cap and respectfully saluted the quiet old man. Everyone else had been ready to forget. No one moved. The plaza, that had echoed with whispers only moments earlier, fell into complete silence as Dr. Julian Crow held his salute before Silas Reed. The elderly black man returned it with the same calm precision. Nothing more, nothing less. When both men lowered their hands, hundreds of eyes shifted toward Rear Admiral Vance Harlan. For the first time that morning, the confident officer looked uncertain. Vance cleared his throat. "Dr. Crow, perhaps we've had a misunderstanding." Crow's expression remained unreadable. "A misunderstanding usually begins with a question, Admiral. What happened here began with an accusation." Several reporters immediately scribbled the quote into their notebooks. Sierra Blake quietly whispered to her cameraman, "Stay on them. Don't cut away." The camera remained fixed on Vance. The Admiral forced a polite smile. "If Mr. Reed is an honored guest, no one informed my office." Crow replied without raising his voice, "You were informed." Vance frowned. "My office received no briefing." The briefing was classified. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. Vance folded his arms. "Then surely you understand why I questioned someone whose records cannot even be accessed by Naval Personnel Command." Crow nodded once. "I understand why you asked." His voice became noticeably firmer. "I do not understand why you humiliated a 74-year-old veteran before verifying the facts." The word struck harder than a shouted accusation. Vance felt dozens of cameras pointing directly at him. Before he could respond, Sierra stepped forward. "Rear Admiral Harlan, do you wish to respond to Dr. Crow's statement?" Vance hesitated for only a second. "I acted according to the information available." Crow quietly interrupted. "No, you acted according to your assumptions." The crowd grew even quieter. Nearby, Gold Star families exchanged uneasy glances. One mother clutched the folded flag that had been presented at her son's funeral years earlier. She looked toward Silas. "My boy would have hated seeing this." Her husband nodded silently. He always said, "Respect comes before rank." Meanwhile, two armed sailors carefully lowered the long transport case onto the stage. Heavy steel locks secured each end. Red security seals covered the latches. Commander Avery Lang stared at the container. "I've never seen archive security like that." Captain Grant Hollis answered softly, "Neither have I." Vance noticed the growing attention surrounding the case. "If that contains classified material," Crow calmly answered, "it does. Then it shouldn't be opened in public." Crow looked directly at him. "It will be opened exactly where it was ordered to be opened." Vance's jaw tightened. "And who gave that order?" Crow slowly removed a sealed document from his folder. "The Secretary of the Navy." Even Vance had no argument. Across the plaza, Master Chief Roland Voss continued studying Silas Reed. Something deep inside his memory refused to let go. He slowly approached. "Mr. Reed." Silas turned. Roland looked into the old man's eyes for several long seconds. "I know we've never officially met." Silas smiled gently. "No. But I think—" Roland paused. "I think I saw you once." Silas said nothing. "It was years ago. A training compound. You walked past our barracks before sunrise. You weren't wearing any insignia. No name tape, no unit patch." Roland's breathing became uneven. "The instructors ordered every trainee to face the wall until you disappeared." A faint smile crossed Silas's face. "That was a long time ago." Roland suddenly felt chills. "So it was you." Silas neither confirmed nor denied it. Instead, he quietly asked, "How have the years treated you, Master Chief?" Roland blinked. I retired 10 years ago." "You earned it." Those three words somehow carried the weight of genuine respect. Roland stood speechless. Vance watched the exchange from a distance. His patience was wearing thin. He walked back toward the center of the gathering. "Ladies and gentlemen," his commanding voice once again filled the plaza. "This ceremony honors transparency, sacrifice, and service." He looked toward Silas. "If there truly is an explanation, then let everyone hear it." Several reporters nodded. Vance continued. "Mr. Reed, if your military service deserves this level of secrecy, tell us yourself." Silas looked at him quietly. "I can't." Vance spread his hands dramatically. There. He turned toward the audience again. He refuses. Crow immediately stepped forward. He refuses because he gave his word. Vance frowned. His word? A lifetime oath. Vance scoffed. To whom? Crow answered without hesitation. To the United States. The words landed heavily. Some spectators lowered their eyes, others looked back at Silas with growing curiosity rather than suspicion. Vance, however, refused to yield. With respect, Doctor, he pointed toward the sealed transport case. If you're asking everyone here to simply believe a story without evidence, that's not how the military works. Crow's expression softened slightly. No, Admiral, it isn't. He slowly turned toward the two armed sailors. Break the seals. Every conversation stopped instantly. One sailor removed a small cutter. The first red security seal snapped, then the second. The heavy steel latches clicked open one after another. The lid rose only a few inches before everyone nearby noticed another container inside, smaller, black, wrapped in protective cloth. Across its surface, embossed in fading silver letters, were words almost no one present had ever seen. Naval Special Activities Command, Project Orion. Master Chief Roland Voss staggered backward, his face drained of color. Oh my God! Vance stared at the words in disbelief. He had spent 3 decades inside the Navy, yet he had never once heard of Project Orion. Crow slowly lifted the black case with both hands. Then he looked directly at Rear Admiral Vance Harlan. Admiral, what you're about to witness has remained hidden from the American people for decades. Not a single person dared to speak. The words Project Orion seemed to drain the sound from the entire Memorial Plaza. Even the ocean breeze felt strangely still. Rear Admiral Vance Harlan stared at the black case, searching his memory. Nothing. 30 years in the Navy, countless classified briefings, joint special operations conferences, top secret clearances, yet he had never once heard the name. Impossible, he whispered. Dr. Julian Crow gently laid the smaller case across the ceremonial table. This archive remained sealed under presidential authority for more than 4 decades. Vance immediately stepped forward. If that's true, Crow looked at him. It is. Then why wasn't Naval Special Warfare Command informed? Crow answered calmly, because very few people were. He slowly entered a 12-digit security code. A soft electronic tone echoed from inside the case. Then came a mechanical click. The lid unlocked. Inside rested several weathered folders wrapped in protective sleeves, a faded mission journal, a collection of undeveloped reconnaissance photographs preserved in archival packets, and beneath them, a dark blue velvet box bearing the gold seal of the Department of the Navy. No medals were displayed, no decorations. Everything remained untouched. Crow deliberately kept the contents hidden from the crowd. Sierra Blake zoomed in with her camera. What exactly are we looking at? Crow didn't answer immediately. Instead, he carefully lifted the oldest folder. Across the cover appeared only a handful of typed words. Project Orion. Mission status, declassified. Authorized release, today. The crowd gasped. Vance looked from the folder to Silas. So this wasn't declassified years ago. Crow shook his head. It became public this morning. Several reporters exchanged astonished looks. You mean? Sierra asked. The timing wasn't coincidence. No. Crow glanced toward Silas Reed. Mr. Reed received his invitation because the government intended to honor him today. Vance's expression tightened. Honor him for what? Crow closed the folder again. I'll explain. But first, he turned toward Silas. Mr. Reed. Silas quietly nodded. Would you join me? The elderly black man slowly walked back toward the stage. This time, no one stepped aside because they were ordered to. They stepped aside out of respect. Petty Officer Caleb Thorne instinctively came to attention as Silas passed. So did Sergeant Nora Hale. Neither realized they had done it until afterward. Commander Avery Lang noticed. They saluted him without thinking. Captain Grant Hollis quietly replied, Sometimes experience recognizes experience. Vance refused to let the moment shift beyond his control. Doctor, Crow faced him. Before you reveal classified history, I want one question answered. Crow waited. Vance pointed directly at Silas. What was his rank? The plaza fell silent again. Everyone waited. Crow slowly smiled. That's the wrong question. Vance frowned. No, it's the only question. Crow looked around the audience. Most military careers are measured by rank. He paused. Some are measured by responsibility. Then he looked back at Vance. There are missions where rank becomes secondary. The answer frustrated Vance even more. You're avoiding it. No, I'm protecting context. Vance's jaw clenched. I've earned the right to know. Crow's eyes hardened slightly. No, Admiral. You've earned the clearance you currently possess. They are not the same thing. The sentence struck like a slap. Several senior officers lowered their heads. No one had ever spoken to Vance that way in public. Roland Voss slowly approached the stage. His voice trembled. Doctor, Crow nodded. Master Chief Voss. Roland swallowed. I trained at North Island years ago. I remember. There were stories. Crow smiled faintly. There always were. Roland hesitated. They said there was one unit nobody acknowledged. They weren't SEAL Team 1, they weren't Team 2, they weren't listed anywhere. Crow remained silent. Roland looked toward Silas. The instructors called them ghost divers. A wave of whispers spread through nearby veterans. Vance immediately interrupted. Urban legends. Roland ignored him. They said those men accepted missions no one else could know about. They disappeared before sunrise. They came back without names. No medals, no interviews, no recognition. Crow quietly replied, Legends usually begin with a fragment of truth. Vance folded his arms. So now we're discussing ghost stories. Crow calmly lifted another folder. No, we're discussing history. Before anyone could respond, one of the archive specialists removed a sealed evidence envelope from the case. Inside rested an old silver ring. The metal had faded with age. Its surface carried a simple engraving, an eagle, an anchor, a trident encircled by 13 tiny stars. Roland's breathing caught. I knew it. Crow held up the ring. This belonged to every member of Project Orion. Vance frowned. I've never seen that insignia. You weren't supposed to. Crow carefully turned toward Silas. Mr. Reed. Silas quietly reached into the pocket of his faded jacket. Without speaking, he placed an old silver ring into Crow's open hand. The two rings matched perfectly. Even the scratches along the edge appeared identical. A collective gasp rolled across the plaza. Sierra Blake whispered into her microphone. Whatever Project Orion was, Mr. Reed was part of it. Vance's confidence continued slipping away. Still, he wasn't ready to surrender. A ring proves very little. Crow nodded. You're correct. He gently returned Silas's ring. A ring proves nothing. He then looked toward the archive specialists. Bring the photographic records. One specialist carefully opened another protective case. Inside were dozens of black and white reconnaissance photographs. Most showed helicopters, submarines, dense unknown coastlines. Every photograph had names covered by thick black classification bars, except one. The final photograph remained face down. Crow placed his hand on it, but did not turn it over. Not yet. Vance stared impatiently. What are you waiting for? Crow answered quietly. For everyone here to understand one thing. He slowly looked across the crowd. This ceremony was never intended to celebrate medals. It was intended to correct one of the greatest debts in modern Navy history. No one spoke. Crow continued. For decades, one man carried a promise that prevented him from telling his own family what he had done for his country. He looked directly at Silas, and he kept that promise. Silas lowered his eyes. I wasn't the only one. Crow nodded respectfully. No, but you're the last one still alive. The words seemed to stop time. A young sailor removed his cap, then another. Soon, dozens of sailors quietly followed. Even civilians instinctively stood straighter. Only Vance Harlan remained motionless. His pride still refused to bend. If he's truly the last surviving member, he said firmly, then show us the evidence. Crow looked at him for several long seconds. Finally, he rested both hands on the final photograph lying face down upon the table. Very well, Admiral. He slowly began turning the photograph over. And once you see this, nothing you said to Silas Reed this morning will ever be forgotten. Every pair of eyes followed Dr. Julian Crow as he slowly turned over the final photograph. The image had faded with time, its edges yellowed after decades in storage. 7 men stood shoulder to shoulder on the deck of a submarine under the cover of darkness. Every face except one had been covered by thick black classification bars. Only a single figure remained visible. A young black sailor stood at the center of the team, his expression calm, his uniform without rank insignia or unit markings. His eyes were unmistakable. Even after so many years, there was no mistaking them. Sierra Blake looked from the photograph to the elderly man standing only a few feet away. My God, it's him. Whispers swept through the plaza. That's Mr. Reed. He was so young. So Project Orion was real. Vance Harlan studied the photograph for several long seconds. Then, unexpectedly, he shook his head. No. The crowd fell quiet once again. Crow slowly looked up. No? Vance stepped forward, pointing toward the photograph. A picture proves he existed. It doesn't prove he did anything extraordinary. Several officers looked at one another in disbelief. Even Commander Avery Lang blinked in surprise. The evidence before them had already shifted the atmosphere of the ceremony. Yet, Vance refused to surrender his certainty. He folded his arms. I've seen classified photographs before. I've seen missions kept secret for decades. He glanced toward Silas. None of that explains why this man deserves to stand above thousands of honorable SEALs who served openly. Roland Voss closed his eyes. Admiral, please? Vance ignored him. Instead, he faced Silas once more. Mr. Reed, You've stayed silent all morning. If these people are willing to risk their reputations defending you, then defend yourself. Silas looked at him quietly. There is nothing I need to defend. Vance let out a bitter laugh. Still hiding behind secrecy? No, Silas answered gently. I'm honoring the men who never came home. The sentence silenced several veterans. Vance, however, refused to let it end there. So tell everyone. He spread his hands dramatically. What exactly did you do? How many missions? How many deployments? How many men did you command? Again, Silas remained silent, not because he lacked answers, because he had lived for decades believing those answers belonged to history, not to himself. Vance turned toward the audience. You see, this is exactly what concerns me. He lets everyone else build a legend around him, but he won't say a single word. Sierra Blake lowered her microphone. Something about the Admiral's determination now felt less like professionalism and more like pride refusing to admit it might be wrong. Nearby, one of the Gold Star mothers stepped forward. Her name was Lillian Croft. She held the folded flag from her son's funeral tightly against her chest. Admiral. Vance looked at her. Yes, ma'am. She spoke quietly. My son was a Navy corpsman. He died in Afghanistan. Vance nodded respectfully. I'm deeply sorry for your loss. Lillian continued. He used to tell me something before every deployment. Vance waited. He said the strongest warriors were the ones who never needed to remind anyone how strong they were. She turned toward Silas. This gentleman reminds me of my son. Vance remained silent. Before he could answer, another voice joined hers. A retired Marine colonel, then a Vietnam veteran, then the widow of a fallen SEAL. One after another, people who had come to honor sacrifice found themselves defending a man whose past they still didn't know. Not because they knew who Silas Reed was, but because they knew dignity when they saw it. Vance noticed the mood shifting. He couldn't allow public sympathy to replace military procedure. He stepped toward the microphone at center stage. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice echoed across the plaza. I appreciate your compassion, but emotions cannot replace facts. He turned toward Crow. If Project Orion was truly authorized, where are the mission reports, the after-action reviews, the commendations, the witnesses? Crow answered calmly, inside this archive. Vance nodded. Then open everything. Crow studied him carefully. Once these records become public, they can never be hidden again. Vance answered without hesitation. Good, because if this man's reputation is genuine, I'll gladly admit I was mistaken. But if it isn't, he looked directly at Silas. Then everyone deserves to know that as well. For the first time all morning, Crow glanced toward Silas as if asking permission. The old man gave the slightest nod. Crow understood. He turned to the archive specialist. Proceed. The velvet box was carefully lifted from the case. One specialist opened it. Inside rested a single bronze-colored identification tag unlike any military credential anyone present had ever seen. No rank, no serial number, no branch designation, only 3 engraved words, Orion Operative 7. A stunned silence followed. Roland Voss whispered. They didn't even use names. Crow nodded. No. They surrendered them. Vance frowned. Surrendered? Crow looked toward the audience. When Project Orion began, the volunteers signed documents accepting that if they were captured, wounded, or killed, the United States government would officially deny they had ever existed. Gasps spread through the crowd. Sierra's cameraman lowered the camera for a second. Denied? Crow continued. They accepted missions without recognition. They accepted victories without medals. They accepted deaths without public funerals. The weight of those words settled over everyone. Silas quietly looked toward the memorial wall. So many promises, he whispered. So many good men. Vance felt uncertainty creeping into his thoughts for the first time, but years of pride pushed him forward once again. If that's true, he said firmly, there should still be someone alive who can verify every word you're saying. Crow looked at him. There is. Vance immediately asked, Who? Crow checked his watch. He should be arriving now. Almost on cue, the distant sound of helicopter blades rolled across the harbor once again. Heads turned toward the sky. A dark Navy helicopter descended beyond the ceremony grounds. Its rotors slowed. The cabin door opened. 2 young officers stepped out first. Then they carefully assisted an elderly man wearing a dark navy blazer covered with only one small lapel pin. No medals, no decorations, just a simple trident. Roland Voss's eyes widened. He took one trembling step forward. It can't be. Captain Grant Hollis stared in disbelief. Is that? Crow smiled softly. Yes, the only commanding officer ever assigned to Project Orion. Vance's face lost its color because he knew that name. Every SEAL officer in America knew that name, and the man walking slowly toward the ceremony had personally trained the generation of commanders Vance had spent his career admiring. Every conversation died the instant the elderly man stepped out of the helicopter. Even before anyone recognized his face, they recognized the reaction around him. 4 Navy captains came to attention, then 2 admirals. Then every enlisted sailor standing within sight instinctively straightened their posture. No command had been given. Respect moved through the plaza like a wave. The elderly officer walked slowly with the assistance of a polished wooden cane. His silver hair stirred gently by the coastal wind. Though age had bent his shoulders, nothing had diminished the quiet authority in his eyes. Rear Admiral Vance Harlan felt his heartbeat quicken. He knew exactly who was approaching. "Admiral Weston Hale," he whispered. The retired 4-star admiral was more than a military legend. He had commanded some of the Navy's most dangerous operations during the Cold War. His leadership was studied at the Naval War College. Vance himself had quoted Hale's speeches countless times throughout his own career. The plaza became so silent that the tapping of Hale's cane against the pavement echoed across the ceremony grounds. Captain Grant Hollis hurried forward. "Admiral Hale." Hale acknowledged him with a nod but never slowed his pace. His destination was obvious: Silas Reed. When the two men stood face to face, neither spoke for several long seconds. They simply looked at one another. Decades disappeared in that quiet moment. Then Hale smiled. "You've gotten old." A gentle laugh escaped Silas. "So have you, sir." The crowd chuckled softly. It was the first genuine smile anyone had seen from Silas all morning. Hale suddenly straightened as much as his age allowed. Then, despite protests from the officers nearest him, the 81-year-old retired admiral raised his right hand in the sharpest military salute his aging body could still deliver. "I've waited decades to do this in public." Silas's eyes glistened. He returned the salute. Several veterans quietly wiped away tears. Vance stood frozen. The highest-ranking retired officer present had just saluted the very man Vance had tried to remove from the ceremony. Hale slowly lowered his hand. "I should have done that decades ago." Crow stepped beside him. "Admiral, with your permission." Hale nodded. "It's time." Crow carefully lifted the bronze identification tag marked Orion Operative 7. Then he turned toward the audience. For decades, the identities of Project Orion remained classified because every surviving member honored the oath they signed. He looked toward Silas. Today, that silence ends. Vance finally found his voice. "Admiral Hale?" Hale faced him. "Yes." Vance swallowed. "Was Mr. Reed truly part of Project Orion?" Hale answered without hesitation. "No." Vance blinked. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. Crow looked toward Hale, surprised. The old admiral continued calmly. "He wasn't merely part of Project Orion. He became the reason it survived." The plaza erupted with whispers. Vance felt the ground shifting beneath him. "What does that mean?" Hale slowly turned toward Silas. "There were 7 operators on the final Orion mission." He paused. 6 of them expected to die. His voice grew softer. The 7th refused to let them. Crow carefully lifted another folder from the archive. Inside rested a faded operational map. Red markings covered nearly every route. One narrow escape corridor had been drawn in blue ink. Hale pointed toward it. "That line shouldn't exist." No one understood. Hale continued. "The mission commander had ordered a full retreat. Silas disobeyed." Vance frowned. "He disobeyed a direct order." "Yes." Hale looked him directly in the eye. "And by doing so, he saved every surviving American on that island." Complete silence. Vance stared at Silas in disbelief. "But why wasn't he court-martialed?" Hale smiled faintly. "Because sometimes the right decision arrives after the wrong order." Several officers quietly exchanged astonished looks. Sierra Blake whispered into her microphone. "History may be changing before our eyes." Hale slowly walked closer to Silas. "Do you remember what you told me before you went back?" Silas looked toward the harbor. "I said no family should receive 7 folded flags if one man could still walk." Hale nodded. "And you walked." His voice cracked. "Alone." Roland Voss covered his mouth with one trembling hand. Even after decades in uniform, he had never heard such a story. Vance could no longer hide the uncertainty on his face. He looked toward Crow. "Where's the mission report?" Crow answered quietly. "You're about to see it." He motioned to one of the archive specialists. The lights surrounding the ceremony dimmed. A large projection screen descended behind the memorial stage. The specialist connected an old military film projector that had been transported inside the archive case. The machine hummed to life. Its reels began turning slowly. Static flickered across the screen. Then another line. "Project Orion. Final debrief." Every veteran on the plaza unconsciously held their breath. Hale stepped beside Silas. Without saying a word, he gently rested one hand on the old man's shoulder. Vance Harlan watched the projector beam illuminate the screen. For the first time since confronting Silas Reed that morning, he realized he no longer wanted to prove the old man wrong. He only wanted to know the truth. The screen brightened. The first frame of the long-hidden mission recording finally appeared. The projector screen flickered. For several seconds, the audience saw nothing but static. Then an old black and white image appeared. A remote coastline. A military transport vehicle hidden beneath thick jungle cover. The entire memorial plaza became completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The recording quality was poor, but the voices were clear. A younger Admiral Weston Hale appeared on the screen, standing inside a temporary command center. His face was decades younger. His voice carried the pressure of a mission where every second mattered. "We have lost communication with extraction," a younger voice answered. "Commander, we have civilians trapped inside the facility." Hale on the recording looked toward a tactical map. "The order is to withdraw." A moment of silence followed. Then another voice spoke, calm, steady, unshaken. "Sir." Every veteran in the crowd recognized something in that voice. It belonged to Silas, the young Silas Reed. The recording continued. "If we leave now, those people don't make it out." The younger Hale stared at him. "Reed, that's a direct order." The younger Silas looked at the commander. "I understand, sir." Another pause. "Permission to complete the rescue." The recording stopped for a brief moment. Then Hale's younger voice answered. "Denied." The crowd held its breath. Vance Harlan watched the screen without blinking. Then came the moment that changed everything. The young Silas looked toward his team, not with rebellion, not with arrogance, with responsibility. "We don't leave people behind." The recording showed 7 operators moving through the darkness. No names, no patches, no recognition, only shadows. Crow quietly explained to the audience. Project Orion was created for missions where official involvement could never be acknowledged. He pointed toward the screen. These men operated without public support, without medals, and without the promise of recognition. The footage continued. The 7 operators entered the abandoned facility. Minutes later, explosions shook the screen. The audience watched silently as the mission unfolded. Then came the moment no one expected. A damaged helicopter appeared in the recording. The extraction route had failed. The team was trapped. A younger Hale's voice echoed through the speakers. "Orion team, report." Static. Then Silas answered. 6 civilians secured. Team status? 1 injured. "Who?" Another pause. "Me." The crowd gasped. Roland Voss closed his eyes. He understood now. The reason Silas had walked with a slight limp all these years. The reason he never complained. The reason he never talked about the past. The recording continued. "Reed, get out of there." The younger Hale's voice was urgent. "No, you don't understand. We need you extracted." Silas answered quietly. "Sir, if I leave, they stay." The video showed a rescue operation lasting through the night. When the final civilians reached safety, the 7 operators were still there. All 7 survived because one man refused to leave anyone behind. The recording ended. The screen went black for several seconds. Nobody reacted. Then the plaza erupted, not with cheers, not yet, with emotion. People were processing the weight of what they had just witnessed. Vance Harlan stood motionless, the man he had called an impostor. The man he had ordered removed was the same man who had saved lives while knowing the world would never know his name. Dr. Julian Crow opened the final folder. "There is more." The crowd became quiet again. Crow looked toward Silas. After the mission, Project Orion was officially closed. The surviving members were offered recognition. He paused. "All except one." Everyone looked confused. "Why?" Crow answered softly. "Because Silas Reed requested that the credit be divided among the entire team." A murmur spread. "He refused personal recognition." Crow nodded. "He said the mission belonged to all 7 men." Hale stepped forward. "And 6 of those men are no longer here to tell their story." His voice became emotional. "Today, we tell it for them." A Navy officer approached the stage carrying a small wooden box. Inside rested a medal, not new, not polished, but carefully preserved. Crow opened it. "This was approved decades ago." He looked at Silas. "But due to classification restrictions, it was never presented." The crowd became silent. The Distinguished Service Medal. A wave of shock moved through the officers. Even Vance looked stunned. Hale gently took the medal. Then he turned toward Silas. "Mr. Reed?" "No." He stopped himself. "Chief Reed." The title echoed through the plaza. Many officers lowered their heads. Hale pinned the medal onto Silas's jacket. The old man looked down at it, not with pride, with remembrance. "I wish the others were here." His voice was barely above a whisper. Hale placed a hand on his shoulder. "They are." He pointed toward the memorial wall. "They've been waiting for this moment." The crowd stood. Every sailor, every veteran, every family member, a sea of people who had come to honor heroes, now honored a man they almost watched walk away in silence. Vance remained standing alone. His face carried something no uniform could hide. Regret. Dr. Crow approached him. "Admiral Harlan." Vance slowly turned. For once, there was no arrogance in his voice. I was wrong. Crow said nothing. Vance looked toward Silas. I judged him before I knew him. His voice lowered. And I did exactly what I spent my career telling others never to do. The cameras captured every word. The entire nation would soon see it. The powerful admiral who believed rank defined honor had finally learned that true heroes often carry no visible title at all. But one final decision remained, because honoring Silas Reed was only the beginning. The Navy still had to answer for what happened that morning, and Vance Harlan would soon face the consequences of the choice he made before knowing the truth. The morning ceremony at Coronado Naval Base was supposed to be a simple day of remembrance. Instead, it became the day the United States Navy finally corrected a decades-old silence. Within hours, footage of Rear Admiral Vance Harlan confronting Silas Reed spread across national news networks. But the image people remembered most was not the Admiral's anger. It was the quiet dignity of an elderly black man who stood there without shouting, without demanding respect, and without revealing the truth he had protected for decades. The Navy launched a formal review immediately, not against Silas, against the system that had allowed his sacrifice to remain forgotten for so long. Later, a special ceremony was held in Washington, D.C. This time, Silas Reed did not arrive alone. He was surrounded by former SEAL commanders, Navy families, and the descendants of the men who served beside him during Project Orion. The same people who once walked past him without knowing his name now stood in line just to shake his hand. Dr. Julian Crow stepped onto the stage. Today, we do not simply honor one man. He looked toward the audience. We honor every person who served without applause, without recognition, and without expecting anything in return. The crowd stood. Then Silas walked forward. The Distinguished Service Medal rested on his chest, but the old man still wore the same simple jacket he had worn that first day. No expensive uniform, no attempt to appear important, just Silas Reed. The Navy Secretary presented him with another honor, the official restoration of his full military record. For decades, his file had been sealed because of Project Orion. Now, for the first time, his service history was public. His bravery, his sacrifices, his loyalty, all finally recognized. Then came another announcement. The Navy established the Silas Reed Center for Veteran Legacy and Service, dedicated to supporting retired service members whose contributions had been overlooked. Because Silas believed something simple: no veteran should feel invisible after giving everything. The words became the foundation of the center. Meanwhile, Rear Admiral Vance Harlan faced the consequences of his actions. An internal review determined that his treatment of Silas was a serious failure of leadership, not because he asked questions. Leaders must ask questions, but because he judged a person before seeking the truth. Vance was removed from his position overseeing ceremonial operations and required to complete a leadership review focused on respect, humility, and ethical command. Many expected Silas to demand the harshest punishment, but when reporters asked him about Vance, his answer surprised everyone. I don't want revenge. The reporter looked confused. After everything that happened? Silas nodded. Yes, the purpose of justice is not to create another person full of anger. He paused. The purpose is to make sure the mistake is never repeated. Those words reached Vance. Several days later, the former admiral requested a private meeting. When Silas entered the room, Vance stood immediately. No uniform, no stars on his shoulders, no authority to hide behind, just one man standing before another. I owe you an apology, Vance said. Silas listened quietly. I saw your appearance before I saw your character. Vance lowered his eyes. I saw what I expected to see, not who you were. A long silence followed. Then Silas nodded. That is something every person must fight against. Vance looked up. Can you forgive me? Silas studied him for a moment, then answered honestly. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is choosing not to carry someone else's mistake forever. Vance nodded slowly, and for the first time, he understood that the greatest lesson he had learned was never written in any military manual. Months later, Silas returned to Coronado. The memorial plaza looked different. A new bronze plaque had been installed beside the wall. It carried 7 names, the 6 men of Project Orion who had never returned, and Silas Reed, not because he wanted his name there, but because history finally owed it to him. Children of military families visited the memorial and learned about courage. Young sailors studied Project Orion, but the lesson was never about secret missions or classified operations. It was about character. One young sailor once asked Silas during a ceremony, Chief Reed, after everything you've done, why didn't you tell people who you were? The old man smiled. Because the work was never about people knowing my name. Then what was it about? Silas looked toward the memorial wall. It was about making sure someone else had the chance to go home. The sailor never forgot those words. Years later, They would become the sentence he repeated whenever someone asked him what true leadership meant. Because Silas Reed proved something the world often forgets. A person's value is not measured by the uniform they wear, not by the title attached to their name, not by how many people recognize them. Real honor exists even when nobody is watching, and sometimes the quietest person in the room is carrying the greatest story ever told. Life will always test whether we judge people by appearances or by the truth hidden beneath them. The greatest heroes are often the ones who never ask for recognition. If Silas Reed's story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments and tell us what lesson you learned from his journey. And if you believe stories about courage, kindness, and justice still matter, subscribe and join us for more unforgettable stories.